Hi, students. I hope you're doing well. So, this is a little lecture to work you through homework assignment number 6. So this is the one on the concept of equilibrium. So we'll go through a couple of questions and hopefully you'll find that enlightening. So question number 1, normally the most confusing thing for students when they read this question is they say, what does he mean? Or what does the question mean? What price will prevail in the market if it's competitive? So again, I want to remind you there's this metaphor in economics, just like there's a metaphor in biology. So you might be familiar with the idea of evolution and survival of the fittest. So it makes you think of a competition between species when really there is no such thing. It's just a way of describing so that people can get the idea of what's going on. What are the relationships? Well, here we've got competition in economics. And so we use words like prevail, like a victory in a battle, someone prevailed. So it's like the prices are competing with one another, but they're not really. Um, and but so when we're talking about what price will prevail in a competitive market, the answer is going to be the equilibrium price. And um, you should be able to note this by looking at the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve on your graph. And you can see when I hover over the equilibrium point, I get the XY value. The X value, right, is coming from the horizontal axis, and that's the quantity, the equilibrium quantity. In this case, it's 15.8 units. And then the second number is the Y value, which is the $72.40 per unit, which would be the value on the Y-axis. So that's question number 1 for you. So just to finish off, so our answer should be 72.4. And now we have this equation, and I can go ahead and copy that and paste it in the calculator and click equals, and I can see, yeah, that's my answer. And again, this feedback is just to show you how the calculation is going on behind the scenes. So then the next question says, what quantity will be exchanged if the market's competitive? And we already answered that question above. Again, we're talking about equilibrium, but in this case, it's the equilibrium quantity. And in this example, it's 9.17 units. So I'll put 9.17 and I hit submit. And here we go. I can check my answer. And yeah, and again, if you guys are ever worried about rounding error, just remember it's this first, or I should say second significant digit that's important. So Ignithium would score this correctly. It's not literally rounding, it just has a tolerance. So the tolerance is to the penny. So if the answer you see is 9.16, then it'll score 9.15, 9.16, or 9.17. So it gives you a penny on either side of its calculated answer. And so in our case, we got that one correct. Okay, so let's see question number 3. So for question number 3, it says, what price will prevail in the market if it's competitive? Now, this is kind of a good example. Now, there are demand and supply curves here. And again, there are lots of different things that we could do just so we can see better. In this case, because these graphs are randomly determined, the graphs can look weird. So I turned off using the key, the demand and the supply curves, and then I just end up with the equilibrium plotted on its own, and so it's easier to see because I know that's what I'm looking for. So again, the equilibrium quantity is 3.61 units at a price of $107 per unit. So the $107 is the correct answer here. and you just get the feedback of 107. So that's good. You know, I want to say something really quickly before we move on for this example, and it's kind of important later on. So you'll notice that the supply curve is upward sloping, but the demand curve um, doesn't seem to obey the law of demand. We said the law of demand said that demand curves were downward sloping, and that's generally true. But really, what the law of demand says is, if you're being technical, something like demand curves can't slope upward. So flat demand curves and sometimes flat supply curves are things that are special cases. They're an extreme example. So here, I'll turn off the supply curve. We have this flat demand curve, and it just says that at $107, that consumers will buy as much as they possibly can. So really, the relevant point for us is this final point, because the graph just doesn't extend any further. So and it happens to be 107 units. And then also, I'll show you one other thing. So just in terms of terminology, I'll say in passing too, this is what we would call a perfectly elastic demand curve. We're going to talk about elasticity in a couple of chapters, but the concept of elasticity is related to, it's not exactly the same as, but it's related to the slope of the demand curve. So here, consumers are willing to pay $107, and obviously they would purchase if the price was less than $107. But if you hit $107 and a penny, then demand is going to completely disappear. The quantity demanded would go to zero. So this is really a maximum amount that the consumer is willing to pay and not a penny more. So the other thing that I wanted to show you, and I'll go ahead and I'll turn this graph back on where everything, the equilibrium and demand and supply are all present. And then I'm going to go up, I'm going to hit refresh, because in this case, we answered this question. But if, for example, you guys might think this one is clustered too in a way that's not easy to see, and we haven't answered it yet. So it's still available to be answered, but we don't have to answer this version of the question if we don't like the graph. If we want to see things more clearly, I'll just hit the refresh button and I reload the page, and I'll still be logged in. The user will still be logged in. I can go back down to number 4. Now this one still isn't any better. So the other tricks that I showed you might be more useful. But there are times when by hitting the reload button a couple times, you can get a graph that's a little bit more friendly to work with. So I'm going to try it one more time before we move on. But you can see the graphs change every time. Now, maybe this one's a little bit better. Looks kind of like the one we had the very first time. But still, you know, there's a chance you could weed out the equilibrium in there. You just have to do so carefully. And I did it here. But since I know that we're looking for the equilibrium because they're talking about the prevailing price and the market's competitive, I'm just going to go ahead and isolate it. And by, again, turning off the demand and supply. And so it's what price will prevail if the market's competitive, and it would be $104 per unit. Submit. And we got the answer right. Okay, that's good. So again, this is another one, and I'm not going to answer it because you guys should be able to answer it based on what we've been discussing so far. But I'll just point out now we have a perfectly elastic supply curve, so things are a little bit different. And what the perfectly elastic supply curve means, the flat supply curve, is that suppliers won't supply any if the price is below $19 per unit. But as soon as it hits 19, they're willing to supply a potentially, if the graph was going to continue, a potentially infinite quantity of the good. So again, it's an extreme case, but there are some instances a little bit further into the course where these types of demand and supply curves that are flat play a special role in helping us figure out what's going to happen in the economy in a particular market as that market evolves, goes forward into the future. Okay, so question number 6, what quantity will be traded if the market is competitive? Again, I'm sure you guys can answer that one. What are sellers willing to sell at a price below $18 per unit? So this one is kind of tricky, right? Because I kind of answered that for you guys before, so I'll just leave it and let you guys figure out. And this one says, how much are buyers willing to purchase at a price above $19 per unit? So this is, again, the maximum amount that buyers would pay. So you guys can answer that question. And again, you could go back and you guys could read this in your text too. And then question 9, what quantity will be purchased? Will buyers purchase if the market's competitive? Very straightforward question based on what we've been going over. And what quantity will sellers sell if the market's competitive? Okay, so I'll just say one thing about questions 9 and 10 before I let you guys go. And that is that questions 9 and 10 are attempting to try to get students to make the connection between the idea of an equilibrium quantity and what is special about the equilibrium quantity. Namely, that the equilibrium quantity is that one quantity at a particular price where the buyer's purchases and the sales of the seller match up. So I'm not going to say more about it than that, but I've given you guys a really, really good hint. And you should be able to figure out the rest on your own. Okay, so that is all that I have to say about homework assignment number 6 on equilibrium. Okay, talk to you guys soon.